In the swirling heat of the North African desert, where the sands stretch endlessly beneath a blistering sun, the winds of war were gathering. The year was 1943, and the Allied forces had finally committed to a campaign that had been long in the making: the liberation of North Africa from the grip of the Axis powers. But before victory could be claimed, a brutal clash was inevitable. It would come not in the vast expanses of the open desert, nor in the grand sweep of an epic offensive, but in a narrow, treacherous passage: Kasserine Pass. The stage had been set months earlier, when the tides of war began to shift in favor of the Axis forces under the command of the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel's audacity, cunning, and unparalleled knowledge of desert warfare had turned the North African campaign into a nightmarish landscape for the Allies. His ability to outmaneuver and outwit the British Eighth Army, despite being vastly outnumbered and under-equipped, made him a figure of fear and respect across the war-torn continent. The stakes in North Africa were more than strategic; they were existential. Whoever controlled the region would control the vital Mediterranean supply routes, the Suez Canal, and the oil fields of the Middle East. To the Axis powers, these were crucial lifelines. To the Allies, they were a necessity for launching further operations into Europe. The Mediterranean was the gateway to a future victory, and the desert held the key to it all. But as the Axis closed in on their objectives, the Allies were still learning how to fight as a cohesive unit. American forces, who had entered the fray late, were particularly inexperienced. They were equipped with modern weaponry and vehicles, but lacked the battle-hardened veterans needed to stand toe-to-toe with Rommel's seasoned Africa Corps. The Americans had not yet been tempered by the furnace of war. They were raw, untested, and unsure of their place in the harsh realities of the battlefield. In the fall of 1942, the American and British forces began their combined effort to push the Axis back. The operation, codenamed Torch, landed in North Africa, specifically in Morocco and Algeria, and was seen as the opening salvo of a broader strategy to weaken German forces in Europe. It was intended to draw attention away from the stalemate on the Eastern Front and divert Axis resources to North Africa. The goal was clear: defeat Rommel's forces, secure the region, and prepare for the eventual Allied invasion of Italy and, later, mainland Europe. However, even as the Allies moved to gain a foothold, the challenges were immense. The Axis forces were not easily pushed back, and Rommel's mastery of the desert terrain allowed him to strike fast and strike hard. His tactics, a mix of lightning-fast raids and brutal counterattacks, had kept the Allies on the defensive for months. The American forces, though bolstered by the arrival of fresh troops and new equipment, struggled to integrate with the British command structure. Their inexperience on the battlefield, compounded by poor leadership and a lack of cohesion, quickly became apparent. The Germans had already demonstrated their ability to strike decisively, and the Americans had yet to prove they could do the same. For them, North Africa would be their first real test of war, a baptism by fire that would either make or break their resolve. It was against this backdrop that Rommel prepared for his counteroffensive. His forces, though stretched thin, had been bolstered by supplies and reinforcements from Italy and Germany, and his reputation for swift, punishing strikes had earned him a formidable position on the battlefield. The Americans, meanwhile, were still finding their footing, their forces scattered and their tactics unrefined. It was in this chaotic environment, where both sides were preparing for a decisive blow, that Kasserine Pass would become the crucible of their clash. The pass, a narrow gap between the Atlas Mountains, was more than just a physical obstacle. It was a symbol of the fragility of the Allied position in North Africa. The Americans had assumed they were ready for whatever Rommel could throw at them. They would soon learn that the desert held far more peril than they had anticipated, and Rommel was the master of that terrain. In late January 1943, Rommel's forces struck with terrifying speed. His goal was to break through the American lines, to isolate the Allied forces in Tunisia, and to create a path for the final push toward the Suez Canal. The attack came without warning. Rommel, ever the strategist, had planned his offensive with meticulous care. His tanks, well-oiled and swift, cut through the Allied defenses like a hot knife through butter. The American response was slow and disorganized. Their leadership was fractured, with commanders still struggling to find their bearings in this unforgiving theater of war. Rommel's forces moved quickly, taking advantage of the confusion and lack of coordination among the Allied ranks. Within days, the battle had become a rout, and the Americans were retreating in disarray. In Kasserine Pass, the American forces faced their first true test. Rommel's pincer movement forced the Allies into a defensive posture, with American units scattered and under heavy fire. Tanks rumbled across the desert, firing shells that echoed through the valley. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning oil. The battle was a brutal clash of wills, with the Germans using their superior mobility to encircle the American positions, forcing them into a desperate fight for survival. The defeat at Kasserine Pass was a painful blow for the American forces, but it was also a moment of reckoning. The Americans had learned valuable lessons in those desperate hours, lessons that would shape their approach to the war in the months to come. Despite the initial chaos and the heavy casualties, they would adapt. They would learn from their mistakes. They would grow stronger in the face of adversity. But for now, Kasserine Pass was a brutal reminder of how fragile the Allied position in North Africa truly was, and how much they still had to learn before they could take on the full might of Rommel's Africa Corps. The defeat would be a pivotal moment in the North African campaign, a harrowing experience that would forge the American military into a more cohesive and formidable force in the months and years ahead. The battle for North Africa was far from over, but the lessons learned at Kasserine Pass would echo in the decisions and strategies that followed. The war was not won in the desert, but the path to victory would be forged there, through blood, sweat, and the unyielding will to survive. In the heart of the Tunisian desert, under the relentless sun and the constant buzz of unseen enemy aircraft, the fate of American forces was being sealed in the most brutal way imaginable. The American soldiers who had arrived in North Africa brimming with the optimism of new recruits were now being tested in the crucible of combat. It was a trial by fire, one they had never truly prepared for. The scenes of chaos and confusion that unfolded in the early days of the Battle of Kasserine Pass began not in the distant canyons of the pass itself, but in two small towns, Sidi Bouzid and Zbaitla, where the Allies' first real encounter with Rommel's forces would reveal the sharpness of the Germans' strategic edge and expose the glaring weaknesses of the American fighting force. The Americans, fresh from their relatively brief experience in the European theater, were untested in the harsh conditions of desert warfare. They had trained in Europe, but the environment they now faced was unlike anything they had encountered before. The heat was stifling, the terrain unforgiving, and the enemy was as elusive as it was ruthless. Rommel, the Desert Fox, was a commander forged by the trials of the African terrain, his tactics honed through years of relentless fighting. The Americans, however, were still trying to understand the nuances of desert warfare, still learning how to use the land to their advantage, and still finding their way in a battle that was not only physical, but psychological. The battle began at Sidi Bouzid, a small town nestled between the harsh desert and the distant mountains. The Americans, under the command of General Lloyd Fredendall, had assumed control of the area, but their hold was tenuous. Their positions were spread thin, with little coordination between units and even less communication between their various divisions. Intelligence reports at best were inconsistent and at worst completely ignored. There was no unified strategy, no clear understanding of the enemy's movements. What the Americans didn't know was that Rommel had already set his sights on Sidi Bouzid and the surrounding area. His forces, well organized and accustomed to the unforgiving desert, would strike swiftly and without mercy. On the morning of February 14, 1943, Rommel's forces, moving with terrifying precision, launched their attack. German infantry, supported by tanks and artillery, closed in on the American positions with speed and efficiency that left the Americans reeling. The attack came without warning. The American soldiers, scattered and unprepared, were caught off guard. Commanders struggled to get their troops into position, and confusion quickly turned to panic. The Americans had been trained for a war of static lines, of trenches and fortifications, but this was a different kind of fight, one that demanded flexibility, speed, and decisive action. The Germans, with their superior command and control and their deep understanding of desert warfare, exploited every vulnerability in the American defenses. The initial clash at Sidi Bouzid was a disaster. The Americans, unable to mount an effective defense, were quickly overwhelmed. Tanks were immobilized by artillery fire, communication lines were severed, and units were isolated from each other. It was a collapse that revealed the deep fissures in the American war effort, fissures that had been papered over by optimism and belief in the superiority of their equipment. The reality of war, however, was far harsher. The Americans had failed to appreciate the speed and intensity with which Rommel's forces could strike, and they had failed to adapt quickly enough to counter it. Their lack of experience in combat, compounded by the disorganization and lack of coordination among the American units, made them easy prey for Rommel's veterans. From Sidi Bouzid, the battle quickly shifted to the town of Spitla, further to the north. The Americans, desperate to regroup, had moved their forces here, hoping to create a more solid defensive position. They fortified their lines, but the Germans were already in pursuit, relentlessly hammering away at the American defenses. Again, Rommel's forces struck swiftly, utilizing their superior mobility and knowledge of the terrain. American forces, despite their best efforts, were constantly reacting to German moves rather than dictating the terms of the battle. The Americans were being dragged deeper into a war of attrition, with each day bringing more casualties, more disarray, and more losses in both men and equipment. At Spitla, the same pattern unfolded: confusion, disorganization, and a crippling lack of coordination. The Americans had not yet learned how to fight as a cohesive unit. The result was disastrous. Tanks that could have been used to counter German armor were left vulnerable, and infantry units that were supposed to hold critical positions were scattered. The Americans, it seemed, were out of their depth, and yet the Germans were methodical, calculating, and relentless. They attacked from multiple directions, using their superior firepower and maneuverability to create chaos and break the American lines. What was most troubling for the Americans was their inability to adjust. Their reliance on traditional tactics honed during their training was proving to be a liability. They were accustomed to fighting in a way that made sense in Europe, where the terrain was more familiar and the battles more predictable. But in the desert, everything was different. The vast empty spaces, the lack of cover, and the constant threat of German air superiority turned every battle into a fight for survival. The Americans were slow to adapt to this new environment, and their mistakes were paid for in blood. By the time the fighting at Sidi Bouzid and Spitla had died down, the American forces had suffered significant losses, both in terms of personnel and equipment. Tanks had been destroyed, trucks had been left stranded, and entire units had been wiped out. The scale of the defeat was staggering, but what was even more crushing was the realization that the Americans had not just lost the battle, they had lost the initiative. Rommel's forces had once again proven their dominance, and the Americans were left licking their wounds, realizing that they had underestimated their enemy in ways that would take time to overcome. The early battles of the campaign in North Africa, at Sidi Bouzid and Spitla, would serve as a painful education for the American forces. They would learn the hard lessons of combat, the importance of speed, coordination, and flexibility, the necessity of knowing the terrain and using it to one's advantage, and perhaps most importantly, the unforgiving nature of war itself. These were the brutal lessons that would shape the future of the Allied effort in North Africa. It would take time, and many more lives before the Americans could begin to rebuild their shattered confidence and learn to fight as a unified force. But one thing was certain: the war in North Africa was far from over, and the road ahead would be long and filled with more pain and sacrifice. Yet, in those early moments of defeat, there was a seed of transformation. The lessons learned here would be applied in the battles to come, forging the American forces into a more capable, cohesive fighting machine. In the end, the disasters at Sidi Bouzid and Spatla were not just a testament to the strength of Rommel's tactics, but also to the resilience of the American spirit. Though beaten, they would not be broken. The road to victory was long and hard, but it was the harsh, unforgiving lessons of these early battles that would ultimately forge the way forward. Amidst the vast undulating sands of Tunisia, one man stood as the embodiment of military genius: Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. His very name was synonymous with boldness, cunning, and an uncanny understanding of warfare in the unforgiving terrain of North Africa. But in the spring of 1943, even Rommel, a commander renowned for his audacity, found himself facing an enemy he had underestimated: the American forces. Rommel's initial success at Kasserine Pass was a masterclass in tactical brilliance, as he deftly exploited every vulnerability in the American defenses. Yet beneath his calculated maneuvers lay an underlying concern, one that would soon become impossible to ignore. The Americans, though untested, were not the pushovers he had once believed them to be. Rommel's approach to warfare was never one of cautious calculation. It was one of speed, surprise, and relentless pressure. In the heat of the desert, where the sand shifted like the very course of fate itself, Rommel had learned to outmaneuver his enemies with the precision of a chess master. His forces, though often outnumbered, moved with an eerie fluidity, striking fast and disappearing into the horizon before the enemy could even react. The Germans had mastered the art of mobility in a way that left their opponents scrambling to keep up. By the time Rommel turned his attention to the American forces at Kasserine Pass, he had already established a reputation for boldness and quick thinking. His successes in earlier battles, such as his famous push across Libya and into Egypt, had earned him not only the admiration of his superiors but also a reputation that had preceded him into Tunisia. The American forces, however, were new to the theater, untested and disorganized. Their position in North Africa was precarious at best, and Rommel knew it was only a matter of time before he could strike decisively. But Rommel was not blind to the challenge that lay ahead. While his forces were smaller and stretched thin, he knew that the Americans, though green, were capable of fighting fiercely. What Rommel understood better than most was the inherent advantage of mobility. His tactics would capitalize on this, using speed and surprise to strike at the very heart of the American defense. The first key to his success at Kasserine Pass was his ability to identify weaknesses in the American position. The Allies had created a defensive line, thinking it would be enough to hold the Germans at bay, but it was a line that lacked cohesion. American units, still unfamiliar with the terrain and unaccustomed to fighting together as a single force, were scattered, vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. Rommel's intelligence network was efficient and well-placed, providing him with the information needed to find gaps in the American defenses. Rommel's first move was calculated. He would strike at the most vulnerable point in the Allied line, using his Panzer divisions to break through and create chaos in the rear. On February 14, 1943, Rommel's forces, moving under the cover of darkness and desert fog, launched their attack. It was swift, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Rommel's panzers moved with lethal speed, slipping through the gaps in the American line and hitting critical points before the defenders even had time to react. The American forces were left scrambling to organize a defense, but by then it was too late. The Germans had already seized the initiative. Rommel's tactical brilliance lay not just in his ability to move quickly, but in his understanding of how to exploit the weaknesses of the American soldiers. The Americans, while armed with superior weaponry, lacked the experience to use it effectively in the desert. Rommel, however, had made the desert his ally. He knew how to use its features to conceal his movements and create confusion among his enemies. The Americans, unaccustomed to this kind of warfare, were thrown into disarray. Tanks were isolated, infantry units were scattered, and communication lines were severed. Rommel had forced the Americans into a battle of attrition, a fight where the Germans, with their superior training and cohesion, had the upper hand. The attack at Kasserine Pass was a demonstration of Rommel's ability to read the battlefield and make decisions in real time. He did not rely on rigid plans or predetermined strategies. Instead, he adapted to the fluidity of the situation. As the Americans fell back, Rommel pressed the advantage, driving deep into their lines. His panzers tore through the pass, bypassing strong points and creating gaps for his infantry to exploit. Rommel's forces seemed to be everywhere at once, and the Americans were constantly reacting to German moves, unable to regain the initiative. Yet even as Rommel's forces surged forward, there was an underlying shift in his thinking. While he had anticipated the initial success of his offensive, he began to realize that the American forces were not as easily defeated as he had initially assumed. The American response, though disorganized and chaotic, demonstrated a resilience that was not present in earlier encounters with other Allied forces. The Americans, despite their inexperience, had begun to regroup and reorganize. Rommel's concern grew, not about the immediate outcome of the battle, but about the potential long-term threat posed by these new, rapidly evolving adversaries. Rommel's growing wariness of the American forces was evident in his subsequent maneuvers. While his initial successes at Kasserine Pass were marked by speed and precision, he began to recognize that the Americans were not easily cowed. They fought with a desperation that was both disconcerting and impressive. Even when surrounded, even when outgunned, the American soldiers did not break. They adapted, learned, and began to fight back. Rommel, who had been accustomed to enemy forces buckling under pressure, now faced a different kind of challenge, an adversary that was learning on the fly, an adversary that was beginning to grasp the complexities of desert warfare. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox was solidified not just by his early successes, but by his growing understanding of the American forces. He knew that the initial victory at Kasserine Pass was only one small step in a much larger game. Rommel, ever the strategist, understood that the Americans would eventually learn from their mistakes and become a formidable foe. His tactical brilliance in the early stages of the battle, his use of mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare, had been effective. But as the battle raged on, it became clear that the Americans were beginning to adapt to the desert's brutal lessons. Rommel's victory, though decisive in the short term, came with the realization that the Americans were not the easy prey he had once thought. In the end, Rommel's success at Kasserine Pass was a testament to his tactical superiority, a superiority built on years of experience and an unparalleled understanding of the desert battlefield. But it was also a sobering reminder that even the best commanders must respect their enemies. The American forces, though defeated at Kasserine Pass, were learning, growing, and adapting at an alarming rate. For Rommel, this would be a war not just against the Allied forces, but against time itself. The tactical advantage he held in the desert would be hard-won, and the coming battles would prove that the Americans were no longer the disorganized, inexperienced force they had once been. The Desert Fox's supremacy in North Africa would be tested in ways he had not yet anticipated. In the unforgiving desert, where the sun beats down relentlessly and the winds whip up clouds of sand, the war for North Africa seemed to be turning decisively in favor of the Germans. Erwin Rommel's forces had scored a crushing victory at Kasserine Pass, leaving the American forces disorganized, battered, and on the defensive. The road to Tunis appeared open, and Rommel, confident in his ability to exploit the weakness of the Allies, pressed forward with unrelenting speed. Yet, amid the chaos and confusion, a figure would emerge, one whose leadership and tactical acumen would shift the momentum of the battle in ways that even Rommel could not foresee. That figure was Brigadier General Paul Robinette, a determined and capable officer who would demonstrate that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, The will to fight and the strength of resolve could turn the tide. Robinette, a seasoned officer who had served in Europe and had a wealth of experience in leadership, had witnessed firsthand the disarray of the American forces. As the U.S. Army reeled from the blows dealt by Rommel's panzers, it became clear that a new approach was necessary, one that would require not just firepower but strategy, patience, and most importantly, cohesion. Robinette was the man who would provide that leadership. His counterattack, though modest in size and limited in resources, would prove to be a decisive turning point in the North African campaign. The stage for Robinette's stand was set at the gates of Tebessa, a key location that lay at the threshold of Tunisia's vital supply routes. Rommel, having surged through the pass, had his sights set on this critical area. His forces, battered but still highly effective, pressed on with the momentum of their earlier successes. But Robinette, recognizing the importance of holding the line, immediately set about organizing his forces for a defensive stand that would force Rommel to reconsider his advance. The situation was dire. American forces were still reeling from the defeats at Sidi Bouzid and Spitla, and the odds were stacked heavily against them. But Robinette's experience and quick thinking would allow him to build a defense that would defy expectations. Understanding that his forces were outnumbered and outgunned, Robinette made a critical decision. He would fight not by attacking, but by setting up a well-organized, well-prepared defense. He knew that the terrain around Bessa would provide the perfect setting for a defensive line, and he leveraged it to the fullest. The key to his defense lay in his use of tanks, artillery, and the combined arms techniques that would come to define his counterattack. With limited resources at his disposal, Robinette knew he had to be creative. His solution was simple yet effective. Use the terrain to his advantage and create a defense that would be as difficult to break as possible. The first critical component of Robinette's strategy was the use of hull-down tanks, an essential defensive tactic in the desert. The concept was simple. Tanks would be positioned in natural depressions or behind ridges, with only their turrets visible above the terrain. This would make them more difficult to target by German artillery or aircraft, forcing Rommel's forces to waste valuable resources trying to pinpoint and eliminate these well-hidden positions. The American tanks, though not as advanced as their German counterparts, were now being used in a way that made the most of their strengths. Positioned cleverly, they formed the backbone of Robinette's defensive line, providing a strong deterrent to Rommel's advance. In addition to the hull-down tanks, Robinette coordinated the use of artillery fire to support his positions. The American artillery, while limited in number, was highly effective in countering the German advance. Robinette used his artillery to harass Rommel's forces from long range, disrupting their movements and slowing their momentum. This combined use of tanks and artillery formed a lethal defensive tandem that forced the Germans to think twice before launching their usual lightning-fast attacks. However, it was Robinette's command of combined arms tactics that truly set him apart from the previous leadership. In the face of overwhelming odds, he was able to coordinate his forces, tanks, infantry, and artillery, into a cohesive fighting unit. This integration allowed the American forces to respond to the German advances in real time, shifting forces quickly between different sectors of the defense line as needed. The Germans, accustomed to facing isolated and disjointed American units, found themselves encountering a force that was organized, responsive, and increasingly difficult to break. Rommel, though a master of desert warfare, was faced with a new challenge in the form of Robinette's well-prepared defense. As the Germans advanced on Tebessa, they were confronted not by disorganized retreating units, but by a determined and coordinated defense. Rommel, in his characteristic style, sought to flank and outmaneuver the Americans, but he was repeatedly stymied by Robinette's tactical use of terrain and firepower. The American forces, though still inexperienced in many ways, now had a leadership structure that allowed them to fight effectively. Robinette's command not only held, but in many ways it forced Rommel to rethink his strategy. The battle at Tebessa marked a dramatic shift in the fortunes of the U.S. Army in North Africa. For the first time in the campaign, the Americans were able to stand their ground and inflict significant damage on Rommel's advancing forces. Rommel, who had been expecting another easy victory, was instead faced with a stubborn, well-organized defense that denied him the quick breakthrough he so desperately needed. His forces, though superior in terms of mobility and firepower, found themselves bogged down in a drawn-out battle, unable to break through. The American defenses. Rommel's frustration grew as he realized that the American forces, though still unrefined and raw in many respects, were beginning to grasp the fundamentals of war in the desert. The Germans, who had grown accustomed to overwhelming their enemies through speed and surprise, now found themselves locked in a grinding battle where those advantages were nullified. Robinet's tactical acumen had not only stopped the German advance, but had forced Rommel to reevaluate his entire strategy in North Africa. For the Americans, the success at Tebessa was a morale-boosting triumph. Robinet's counterattack, though it did not result in a decisive victory, proved that the U.S. Army was capable of standing up to the formidable Desert Fox. It was a victory born not from superior numbers or equipment, but from discipline, leadership, and a thorough understanding of the battlefield. Robinet's ability to coordinate his forces, use the terrain to his advantage, and apply combined arms tactics in a way that the Germans could not easily counter was a turning point that would resonate throughout the campaign. Rommel, though still a formidable adversary, had been forced to halt his advance. The American counterattack at Tebessa was not just a military success. It was a statement that the Allies were learning, adapting, and growing stronger. Robinet's leadership would serve as a model for future commanders, proving that with limited resources, a well-prepared and determined force could stand toe-to-toe with the best the Axis had to offer. The battle for North Africa was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. The Americans, having tasted the bitterness of defeat, were now starting to taste the sweetness of resilience and victory. In the aftermath of his initial success at Kasserine Pass, Erwin Rommel stood amidst the shifting sands of the North African battlefield, reflecting on the outcome with a mixture of satisfaction and growing concern. The victory, which had seemed inevitable just days before, had not come without its challenges. While the Americans were still inexperienced and disorganized, there was something about their response to his advances that intrigued him. Rommel, who had made a name for himself as a master of fast, decisive warfare, had expected the Americans to buckle under the pressure of his well-oiled panzers. Instead, he found himself forced to reconsider his earlier assumptions about his enemies. Rommel's journals, written during and after the battle, reveal the evolution of his thoughts as he processed the events at Kasserine Pass. Initially, he had viewed the American forces as nothing more than a collection of inexperienced troops, ill-prepared for the harsh realities of desert warfare. He had expected an easy victory, with little more than a few skirmishes before advancing to his ultimate objective: Tunis. But as the battle unfolded, Rommel began to see a different picture. The Americans, though untested and at times disjointed, showed a resilience that Rommel could not ignore. In his private reflections, Rommel wrote, "They are not as the British, nor the Italians, these Americans. They do not crumble as easily under fire, nor do they break when the enemy closes in. They adapt. Quickly. Too quickly for my liking." Rommel's initial dismissiveness of the American forces had now given way to a grudging respect. He had witnessed firsthand how the Americans had learned from their early setbacks and adapted their tactics on the fly. They were not as proficient in the art of desert warfare as the Afrika Korps, but they were beginning to understand it. And that, to Rommel, was a dangerous development. One entry, written just days after the battle, captures the shift in Rommel's perception. Their response at Kasserine was not one of panic, as I had expected. No, it was one of calculated disarray. Even in retreat, they reorganize, they regroup, they try again. Their command structure is far more flexible than I had anticipated. The way they use their artillery, coordinated with their tanks in ways that seemed amateurish at first, is beginning to show signs of competence. I must be careful, for the longer they stay here, the stronger they will become. Rommel had expected that after the defeat at Kasserine Pass, the Americans would scatter, retreating in disarray, their morale shattered. But instead, he found that the Americans, though disorganized, were learning to fight back. Their defensive stand at Tabessa, orchestrated by Brigadier General Paul Robinette, caught him off guard, and the difficulties he encountered in trying to break through their lines served as a rude awakening. Rommel's tactical genius had been stymied, not just by terrain or weather, but by an enemy that was quickly learning how to counter his tactics. Rommel's growing respect for the Americans was not rooted in admiration for their initial performance, but rather in his recognition of their potential. He saw the signs of a rapidly evolving military force, a force that, while still far from perfect, had the ability to learn, adapt, and grow. Rommel wrote, "The American soldiers may be green, but they are no fools. They have the will to fight, and they have the means to adapt. A foe that adapts is a dangerous one." This realization marked a significant shift in Rommel's perception. Where once he had seen the Americans as a weak, easily defeated force, he now saw them as a formidable adversary, one that would not be easily dispatched. Rommel's cautious apprehension was not merely a result of one setback or defeat. Rather, it was a recognition of a fundamental truth. The Americans were not a static enemy. They were learning, evolving, and growing in strength with every engagement. Rommel's reflections on the battlefield underscored this transformation. "It is not the tanks or the artillery that concern me," he wrote, "but the willingness of the Americans to continue learning, to continue fighting even when their chances seem slim. They learn from their mistakes, and that is the mark of a force that will not be easily defeated." This growing awareness of the Americans' potential was not just a personal insight for Rommel. It was a shift in his entire approach to the North African campaign. No longer could he simply rely on his usual tactics of swift, decisive maneuvers. He would need to consider the possibility that the Americans might begin to anticipate his movements, counter his strategies, and turn the tables on him. Rommel's famed speed and mobility, which had served him so well in earlier campaigns, were now being met with a resistance that was more organized and resolute than he had expected. As the weeks passed and the battlefront in North Africa shifted, Rommel's concerns grew. "The Americans are learning," he wrote in one particularly somber entry, "and when they learn, they fight with a determination that is difficult to match. I do not know how long I can maintain this offensive if they continue to regroup, to reinforce, to improve. My forces, stretched thin as they are, cannot afford to engage in a battle of attrition with an enemy that is learning how to fight. I must find a way to break them now, before they become a true threat." Rommel's changing perception of the Americans was not just a tactical shift, it was a recognition of a deeper truth. The Americans were not invincible, nor were they guaranteed victory, but they were learning, and that learning process would prove to be one of the most dangerous aspects of their war effort. For Rommel, a commander who had based much of his success on quick victories and overwhelming force, this newfound adaptability in the American ranks was a sobering realization. The battle for North Africa, which had once seemed so straightforward, was no longer a simple matter of outmaneuvering an inexperienced foe. It was a battle against a force that, while still imperfect, was rapidly becoming a force to be reckoned with. As Rommel continued his campaign in North Africa, his thoughts about the Americans would continue to evolve. What had once been an enemy he could dismiss with ease was now a challenge that required his full attention and tactical ingenuity. Rommel's journal entries, written with the clarity of a commander who had seen it all, reveal not just his respect for the Americans, but his growing apprehension about their potential. And in that shift, in that dawning recognition that the Americans were learning to fight with determination and skill, lay the seeds of a much larger, more complex battle. A battle that would continue to test the mettle of both the Allies and the Axis, and one that would ultimately change the course of the war. The defeat at Kasserine Pass had been a humbling moment for the U.S. Army. It exposed the rawness of the American forces in North Africa, uncoordinated, inexperienced, and ill-prepared for the rigors of desert warfare. Yet, from the ashes of this crushing defeat, a new leader would emerge, one whose very name would become synonymous with aggression, discipline, and victory. General George S. Patton, a man with a reputation for toughness, boldness, and uncompromising leadership, was called upon to take command of the U.S. Second Corps in the aftermath of the Kasserine debacle. Patton's arrival marked a turning point in the American war effort, and under his command, the U.S. forces would undergo a rapid transformation. Patton's leadership style was immediate, direct, and relentless. He was a man who believed in the power of discipline, the importance of preparation, and the necessity of toughening his soldiers to meet the demands of combat. His approach was not for the faint of heart. His methods were as aggressive as they were effective, and his insistence on perfection would become a hallmark of his command. Patton understood that in order to succeed in North Africa, the Americans had to not only learn from their mistakes, but also be molded into a force that could stand toe-to-toe with the seasoned veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps. To do so, he needed to instill a sense of urgency, order, and cohesion within the ranks. One of Patton's first moves was to address the rampant disorganization that had plagued the American forces. The lack of coordination between units, the poor communication, and the failure to adapt to the desert terrain had all contributed to the defeat at Kasserine Pass. Patton was quick to recognize that these problems were not just tactical, but cultural. The American Army, in its rush to mobilize for war, had neglected the importance of rigorous training and discipline. Under Patton, this would change immediately. He began with his trademark approach, harsh but with a focus on results. His orders were simple: no more excuses. Soldiers were to be trained, prepared, and disciplined at all costs. Patton didn't care for mediocrity. He demanded excellence, and he was willing to go to extreme lengths to get it. His first order of business was the overhaul of the training regimen. He implemented an aggressive schedule that included long, grueling field exercises, combat simulations, and desert survival tactics. Every soldier, from the generals down to the privates, was expected to meet a higher standard. Patton also focused on improving the coordination of his forces. One of the key issues that had plagued the Americans at Kasserine was the lack of communication and integration between infantry, tanks, and artillery. Patton understood that the combined arms approach, using different elements of the military in a coordinated effort, was essential to defeating Rommel's highly mobile forces. Under his leadership, the U.S. Army worked relentlessly to improve this integration. Tank units were paired with infantry, artillery fire was better coordinated with infantry movements, and each unit's actions were synchronized to create a more unified force. This emphasis on operational coordination would become one of Patton's trademarks throughout the war, as he recognized that the true strength of an army lay in the ability to function as a cohesive unit rather than as isolated parts. But Patton's reforms didn't stop with training and operational coordination. He also understood the importance of morale. After the defeat at Kasserine Pass, the confidence of the American soldiers had been shattered. Patton knew that rebuilding that confidence was just as important as improving their combat skills. His methods were often controversial, but they were effective. His famous motivational speeches and charismatic presence served to instill a sense of pride and purpose in his men. He demanded that they take ownership of their failures, but he also reminded them that they were capable of overcoming any challenge. Patton's belief in the potential of his soldiers was unwavering, and this belief was infectious. Patton's leadership was not without its controversies. His harsh methods, his unyielding demands for discipline, and his sometimes abrasive personality often put him at odds with his superiors and with the soldiers themselves. His approach was tough, and his temper was legendary. But for Patton, there was no room for weakness. In his eyes, the price of failure in battle was far too high. The only way to ensure victory was through hard work, dedication, and a relentless drive to improve. In addition to his focus on discipline and coordination, Patton also brought a sense of urgency to the battlefield. He understood the stakes of the North African campaign. Control of the region was critical for both the Allies and the Axis powers. Rommel's forces were formidable, but Patton knew that with the right leadership, the Americans could turn the tide. He wasted no time in ordering aggressive offensives, urging his forces to take the initiative and strike quickly when the opportunity arose. His desire for swift action stood in stark contrast to the often cautious approach of his predecessors, and it served as a powerful motivator for the troops under his command. Patton's influence was felt almost immediately. The transformation of the U.S. Second Corps under his command was nothing short of remarkable. Soldiers who had once been uncertain and disorganized were now imbued with a sense of purpose and focus. The training was intense, but it paid dividends. American forces began to show an improved ability to fight in the desert, coordinating their attacks with precision and speed. The tank crews, once prone to mistakes and hesitation, began to work seamlessly with infantry and artillery units. The communication lines that had been broken during the Kasserine debacle were now more robust than ever, ensuring that orders were carried out with speed and efficiency. The improvements under Patton's leadership were not just tactical, they were psychological as well. The soldiers who had once doubted their own abilities now felt a renewed sense of confidence. They had been pushed to their limits, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Patton had turned them from a disjointed and demoralized force into a cohesive fighting unit, ready to take on Rommel's best. By the time Patton led his forces into battle once again, the difference was clear. The U.S. Army in North Africa was no longer the same force that had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass. Patton's rapid reforms had revitalized the troops, giving them the discipline, training, and confidence they needed to succeed. More importantly, Patton had instilled in his soldiers a sense of purpose, one that would carry them through the remainder of the campaign and beyond. Patton's impact was felt throughout the ranks and beyond the battlefield. His leadership served as a model for future commanders and cemented his legacy as one of the most formidable generals of World War II. Under his command, the U.S. Army would go on to achieve victory in North Africa, setting the stage for the Allies' eventual triumph in Europe. The transformation of the U.S. Army in the wake of the Kasserine Pass defeat was not just a testament to Patton's leadership, but to the indomitable will of the American forces. Through discipline, coordination, and an unwavering drive to succeed, they had become a force to be reckoned with. A force that would soon take the fight to the Axis powers with renewed vigor and determination. The air in the Tunisian desert was thick with tension. The American forces, still reeling from the harsh lessons learned at Kasserine Pass, stood at the edge of a new confrontation. They had been bloodied, humbled, and tested, but they were no longer the disorganized, inexperienced force that had faltered under Rommel's swift and brutal assault. Under the leadership of General George S. Patton, the U.S. Army had undergone a transformation, one forged through discipline, training, and the will to overcome. And now, at El Guettar, they would face Rommel's forces once more. The stage for the battle was set in the rugged hills south of the town of El Guettar, where the Germans, bolstered by their earlier successes, sought to regain the initiative and break through the Allied lines. Rommel's forces were formidable, their mobility and expertise in desert warfare still a significant threat. But this time, the Americans would not simply be reacting to German moves, they were ready to strike back with a newfound confidence and cohesion. The battle at El Guettar was not just another clash between the Allies and the Axis. It was a moment of redemption for the American forces, a chance to prove that they had learned from their mistakes and could stand toe-to-toe with the vaunted Desert Fox himself. The contrast between the two sides could not have been more stark. Rommel's forces, seasoned and battle-hardened, had the experience of decades of warfare behind them. They were experts in desert combat, masters of the rapid, fluid tactics that had earned them their reputation as one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world. The Americans, on the other hand, were still relatively new to the harsh realities of war. But under Patton, they had undergone a radical shift in their approach to battle. Where they had once lacked coordination, they now fought with precision and purpose. Where they had been disorganized and hesitant, they were now bold, aggressive, and willing to take the initiative. The lessons of Kasserine Pass had been learned, and El Guettar would be the proving ground for that newfound resilience. Patton's reforms had revitalized the American forces. The emphasis on discipline, training, and combined arms tactics had paid off. At El Guettar, the U.S. forces put these lessons into practice, and the results were immediate. Patton's insistence on operational coordination had transformed the way American units interacted on the battlefield. Tanks, infantry, and artillery now worked together as a unified force, each component supporting the others in ways that had been unimaginable just months before. The coordination was seamless, the communication swift. Where once the Americans had been overwhelmed by the speed and precision of Rommel's attacks, they now responded with equal speed and tactical mastery. The battle itself began with an aggressive thrust by the Americans who, taking the initiative for the first time in the North African campaign, launched a counterattack against the German positions. The Americans knew that Rommel's forces would not give up their positions easily, but Patton's troops were no longer intimidated by the Desert Fox's reputation. They had faced the Germans before, and they had learned. The soldiers who had once faltered under pressure now moved with confidence, taking advantage of their new training and improved tactics. The American advance at El Guettar was slow and steady, as Patton's forces carefully maneuvered to take key positions and destroy German supply lines. The use of combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, tanks, and artillery into a coordinated effort, allowed the Americans to steadily chip away at the German defenses. The Americans' use of terrain, once a weakness at Kasserine Pass, was now an advantage. Patton's forces moved with precision, using the hills and ridgelines to their advantage, creating a formidable defensive line that the Germans found difficult to penetrate. Rommel's forces, initially confident in their ability to repel the American attack, found themselves bogged down by the coordinated American assault. The Germans were forced to fight a battle of attrition, where their superior mobility was less effective against the well-organized, well-coordinated American units. Patton's leadership and the resolve of his soldiers created a shift in momentum, and the Germans, used to dictating the terms of battle, now found themselves reacting to the Americans' moves. The battle, once thought to be a mere formality in Rommel's campaign, was becoming a costly and drawn-out struggle for the Axis forces. What stood out in the battle at El Guettar was the resilience of the American soldiers. The soldiers who had once crumbled under Rommel's relentless attacks were now pushing forward, fighting with a determination and confidence that reflected the transformation that had taken place under Patton's leadership. Even in the face of stiff German resistance, they pressed on, inch by inch, taking ground and inflicting heavy losses on Rommel's forces. The battle was not without its casualties, but it was clear that the Americans were no longer the disorganized, hesitant force they had been at Kasserine Pass. They were a well-oiled machine, moving with purpose and precision. For Patton, the victory at El Guettar was a vindication of his leadership and the training that he had imposed on his men. It was proof that the American army, though young and untested, could rise to the occasion and meet the challenge of combat with the same tenacity and aggression as their seasoned adversaries. The victory was also a testament to the adaptability of the American soldiers, who, under the pressure of battle, had quickly learned how to fight in the harsh desert conditions and had applied the lessons of previous defeats to their advantage. Rommel, who had once seen the Americans as an easy target, now had to reconsider his assessment of their capabilities. The battle at El Guettar was a stark reminder that the Americans, though inexperienced, were capable of great things when led with the right combination of discipline, coordination, and leadership. Rommel's forces, despite their expertise in desert warfare, had been forced into a retreat, their advance halted by a determined and capable adversary. For the first time in the North African campaign, the Americans had taken the initiative, and they had done so with overwhelming success. The victory at El Guettar was more than just a military success. It was a symbolic victory. It marked the redemption of the American forces, who had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass, and it was a clear sign that the U.S. Army in North Africa had evolved from a disjointed, inexperienced force into a cohesive, formidable fighting unit. The battle was a turning point, not only in the campaign but in the American war effort as a whole. It proved that the lessons learned from defeat could be turned into strength, and that with the right leadership, discipline, and determination, the Americans were capable of overcoming even the most seasoned adversaries. For the soldiers who fought at El Guettar, the battle would remain a defining moment in their careers, proof of their resilience, adaptability, and ability to rise above the challenges of war. And for the American war effort, it was a harbinger of the successes to come. The victory at El Guettar was just the beginning of what would become a relentless push across North Africa. A victory that paved the way for the Allied invasion of Italy and set the stage for the eventual defeat of the Axis powers in Europe. The resilience and adaptability of the American soldiers at El Guettar would become a hallmark of their approach to warfare throughout the rest of the war. The harsh sands of Kasserine Pass had long since settled, but the reverberations of the battle would continue to echo throughout the course of World War II. For the American forces, the defeat in February 1943 had been a painful and humbling experience, one that exposed their rawness and inexperience. Yet the lessons learned from that disastrous clash would become the bedrock upon which the U.S. Army would rise to dominance on the battlefield. As the war in North Africa progressed, and as the American forces proved themselves capable of standing up to the formidable forces of Rommel's Afrika Korps, the Battle of Kasserine Pass became a turning point, a painful but necessary crucible in the development of the U.S. military. For Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the battle was a moment of triumph, but also one of reflection. His early successes at Kasserine had been a testament to his tactical brilliance, his ability to exploit American weaknesses, and his deep understanding of desert warfare. Yet, as the battle unfolded, Rommel's perception of his enemies began to shift. What had initially seemed like an easy victory turned into a sobering reminder that the Americans, while still inexperienced, had the potential to adapt and grow quickly. The lessons of Kasserine Pass were not lost on Rommel. In fact, they became a part of his warnings to his superiors about the evolving strength of the American military. Rommel, in his post-battle reflections, acknowledged that the Americans were far from the pushover he had once believed them to be. In his journals, he remarked, "The Americans are not without merit. Their failure here was not one of courage or will, but of experience. They will learn quickly, and when they do, they will be a formidable force." Rommel's recognition of the Americans' potential was not born of admiration, but of apprehension. He understood that the U.S. Army was not static. It was evolving, adapting, and learning. And as he had seen firsthand at El Guettar, when the Americans learned, they learned fast. Rommel's warnings to his superiors in the wake of Kasserine Pass were stark. "The American soldiers may have faltered today," he wrote, "but they will not falter again. They will learn from their mistakes, adapt their tactics, and fight with an increasing determination. We must not underestimate them." Rommel's concerns were not limited to the immediate consequences of the defeat. Rather, he foresaw a future in which the Americans would grow stronger and more formidable with each passing day. His words, though perhaps not fully appreciated at the time, would prove prophetic. As the war in North Africa progressed, Rommel's respect for the American forces continued to grow. He recognized that the strength of the U.S. Army was not just in its size or firepower, but in its ability to adapt and learn from the battlefield. The Americans, under the leadership of commanders like General Patton, began to fight with a cohesion and coordination that had once seemed impossible. The mistakes of Kasserine Pass were not repeated. They were transformed into lessons that shaped the American approach to warfare. The U.S. forces that had been overwhelmed and disorganized in the early months of the campaign now stood toe-to-toe with the Germans, forcing Rommel to reconsider his assumptions about the war. The legacy of Kasserine Pass, however, extends beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle was a turning point not only for the American forces but for the broader strategy of the Allied war effort. The lessons learned in North Africa would carry over into future campaigns, particularly in Europe, where the U.S. Army would face even greater challenges. The victory at El Guettar, the subsequent campaigns in Italy, and the D-Day invasion of Normandy, all of these were made possible by the resilience, discipline, and adaptability that emerged from the ashes of Kasserine Pass. The defeat at Kasserine had been a brutal wake-up call, but it was also the crucible in which the U.S. Army was forged into a force capable of defeating the Axis powers. In many ways, the Battle of Kasserine Pass marked the birth of the modern American military, one that was not just equipped with superior technology, but with the ability to learn from its mistakes, adapt to the ever-changing realities of war, and fight as a cohesive and formidable force. The American soldiers who had once faltered in North Africa would go on to prove themselves in battles across the world, earning the respect of their enemies and the admiration of their allies. The lessons of Kasserine Pass would be passed down through generations of soldiers, becoming a cornerstone of military doctrine and a defining feature of American military success. For Rommel, the growing strength of the American forces was a reality that could not be ignored. Though he continued to push forward in North Africa, the battle was no longer just about defeating the Allies. It was about managing the inevitable rise of a power that had proven it could learn, adapt, and fight. Rommel's recognition of this growing threat was not just an acknowledgement of the Americans' potential. It was a warning to his superiors that the balance of the war was shifting. The tide of the war was turning, and the Americans, once seen as an easy target, were now becoming the driving force behind the Allied victory. In the broader context of World War II strategy, the Battle of Kasserine Pass had profound implications. It was a reminder that underestimating an enemy could lead to catastrophic mistakes. For the Americans, it reinforced the importance of adaptability, training, and leadership. For Rommel and the Germans, it was a stark lesson in the dangers of complacency and the importance of respecting the potential of even the most inexperienced foes. As the Allied forces advanced through North Africa and beyond, the legacy of Kasserine Pass lingered in the minds of commanders on both sides. The battle had exposed the vulnerabilities of the American military, but it had also shown that the U.S. Army was capable of rapid transformation. In the years that followed, the lessons of Kasserine Pass would serve as a foundation for the Allied victories that followed in Italy, France, and ultimately Germany. For Rommel, Kasserine Pass was both a triumph and a warning. It was a reminder that the Allies, particularly the Americans, were not to be underestimated. And though the Desert Fox would never live to see the ultimate Allied victory, his warnings about the evolving American military would remain a testament to the growing strength of a force that had once seemed ill-prepared, but would soon prove to be one of the most formidable in history.